Hello everybody and welcome back to the Creature Flesh Workshop and part 6 of our making a silicone mask inspired by The Last of Us. So last time we opened up our mold, cleaned it all out and finished it off with the bolt holes, bolted it back together, put our pour spout in for the silicone, and it's now ready to go. But there is one final step to do before we can actually pour the silicone into that mold, and that's what we're going to be doing today. If you haven't had a chance to see all the other parts of this series, please go back and check those out. But without further ado, let's get into the video. Okay, I'm going to be honest, this next step is probably my least favorite part of the whole process, and that is making the power mesh hood that's going to go underneath our silicone mask, and it's going to become part of it to then make the mask a lot stronger. Now, I think the reason I don't really like this part of the process is simply because I don't really know what I'm doing. I feel comfortable with sculpting and mold making and painting, but when it comes to stuff with fabrics, I feel completely out of depth. But it does need to be done, so we're going to give it a go. So the idea of a power mesh hood is that it will be put onto our positive head form before we put the mold together, and then once we pour that silicone in, it will encapsulate the mesh inside that silicone. So it then becomes one, and that just makes the mask much more durable. Silicone is prone to tearing, and even though the EcoFlex silicone that I use is really tough, putting a mesh inside just makes it 10 times stronger. Now, some mask makers will only put their mesh in certain areas where it's prone to tearing, like the eye holes or the mouth, or around the neck where you pull the mask over your head. But I'm going to opt for a full pullover power mesh hood because I think it's just going to give the mask much more durability. So I'm going to be using this stuff, which is power mesh, and it's marketed as like a 4-way stretch mesh, which it does, but it actually stretches more in one direction than it does the other, and that's something that we need to consider when we are placing it on our mask. So you can see in one direction it will stretch that far, but then in another direction it stretches much further. And thinking about the way that the face moves and the way that we want our mask to move as realistically as possible, we want to make sure that we get that stretch in the right direction. So for example, the mouth is going to move up and down, so we want to make sure that that patch of the mesh on the front is going to move as much as it possibly can to give the wearer the ability to open their mouth and make expressions. But in areas where we need more horizontal stretch, such as the neck, we're going to want to place it that way around so it gives it more stretch for when the wearer pulls the mask over their head. So the first thing I need to do is map out a pattern, I think it's what it's called. That is essentially a template that I can use over and over again to be able to cut the right size patches of power mesh to then stitch them together and create a hood that's going to go over this guy. So I'm going to use a Sharpie to map out where these segments of material are going to be, and I want to try and do as little stitching as possible. So I'm thinking one big plate of material on the face, and it's not very symmetrical. So we've got our pattern mapped out. So now I have to figure out a way of actually getting our material on here and then tracing these lines. Now I'm going to try pinning it onto it. I think the pins will stick in. They do. Now I don't have a pin cushion, and I was looking for something to use, and I found this, which actually works pretty well. This is from our making gore with leftover silicone, so if you haven't seen that video, check it out. So I think what I need to do is just kind of lay this over and then try and trace those shapes. I'm going to start with the big flat areas because I figured they'd probably be easier. This is really awkward. Now, something I completely forgot about is I need to make sure that the stretch is going the right way. Luckily for me, it is this time. think what I'm going to do is actually draw arrows for which way I want that stretch to go. I think it doesn't help that there's so much weight on this pulling it down, but hopefully this is the only time I actually have to do this bit, because what I'm going to do is once I've got these cut out, I'm going to lay them over some cardboard or something and then make some templates so I don't have to do this bit over and over again. Okay, 1 down. 6 to go. So we've got our pieces of power mesh all cut out and they're kind of ready to be stitched together. Now, because this is a stretchy material, I need to make sure that the stitch that I stitch is going to stretch along with the fabric. So I'm going to need to do a stretch stitch, or I think it's called a cross stitch. I don't know, I have no idea. But that's what I've done before. I think it works, so we're going to give that a go. So the first bit that I'm going to do is the top of the head, where there's kind of like a seam line, and that's going to bring those two bits together. I figure that's probably the easiest place to start. I've got to say, I'm not enjoying doing something that I don't feel fully confident in. So I'm going to pin these two bits together in the hope that they will stay in place. Now, if you come here looking for a stitching tutorial, this ain't it. This material is also really hard to get a hold of. Okay, I think that's okay. No way, that's not even on the other side. Okay, let's try again. Now, I thought it would be a great idea to use white thread, so when I'm threading the white material, I can't see where the thread is. Now, do I tie this on? Probably not. Now, from the videos that I watched, this stitch kind of goes back on itself to allow it to give it some stretch when it's pulled. Because obviously when we pull this over our head, when we pull the mask over our head, we want to make sure that the actual seam lines stretch as well as the power mesh. How do I know how much thread I need? Where's my needle? Oh, I feel like I've just gone around a big circle there. I think I'm going to be here for a while. We're going to need a time lapse. Okay, I'm pretty shocked because that, I think, actually worked. Now you can see now it's not perfect, but it's definitely working with the stretch of the material. So that's good. And remember, this doesn't have to be a super strong stitch. We're not relying on this stitch to hold these together because ultimately this material is going to become encapsulated in the silicone anyway. And all it's doing is adding the strength. So the idea of these stitches is just to hold it in place while it's on our armature before we pour the silicone. And ultimately this will be turned inside out, and I don't think it looks that bad. So all we've got to do now is stitch everything else. Now, I just wanted to share with you what I've done here. I've been stitching this together. I went to put it on our head form just to see how well it fits. And essentially, I have made a tea bag. I've stitched it all the way around so it's completely enclosed, and I can't pull it over anything. So now I've got to make cuts, I guess, in the bottom just to open that up and figure out how many cuts I need to make, and then see if it fits over the head form, and then stitch the rest on, probably incorrectly. Well, it's not pretty, but we've made our power mesh hood, and I think it's going to serve its purpose for what it's needed. A few of the panels of material I sewed on the wrong way around, so the seam is facing outwards. It looks pretty horrible, but when we pour our silicone in, that's going to hide a lot of my crimes, so I'm not too worried about that. I definitely learned a lot doing it, but I still got a long way to go at being even competent at doing this task. I think I probably need a sewing machine, to be honest. But now the only thing left to do is to pour our silicone mask. Well, that's the end of part 6, and in all honesty, I'm pretty glad that bit's over and done with. But please join us again next time, where we will finally be pouring the silicone into our mold and hoping that everything has worked out as it should. But as always, thanks for joining us. We'll see you on the next one.